BRICS is the new global currency that's about to hit the stage. To say that it's going to turn the world upside down is an understatement. The current global leaders are going to do everything in their power to stop it. They've done it before, twice, leaving the men who attempted it dead and the complete collapse of those men's empires. The US dollar has ruled the globe for the last 80 years, and they sure as hell aren't going to let that power slip through their fingers without a fight. Having a single currency to call on is convenient for global markets and governments since we can all compute its value at any given time. Obviously, this gives the country that wields the dollar an enormous amount of power. Imposing sanctions on countries is one of them. If the US wants to shut a country off from the rest of the world, all they have to do is say the word. Essentially, crippling an entire land overnight and removing anyone that threatens their position. They get to determine who plays on the global field and who doesn't. In the last century, the dollar's reign has been challenged only twice, and both times, the countries in question were completely dismantled. Muammar Gaddafi was one of those cases. The US and the UN didn't really get involved when he revolted against the Libyan monarchy, nor did they interfere when he made friends with his neighboring countries. One of the few times that they wielded their power was when Gaddafi attempted to get the Middle East unified. This is simple global politics. Libya alone did not interest the US enough to warrant any interference, so no matter who lived, died, or suffered, they weren't going to get involved openly just because there was no monetary gain and nothing to lose either way. But the big guns have never wanted the Middle East to unite. They have too much oil and therefore would have too much power if they did manage to come to some sort of agreement to work together. As long as the Middle East is at war with each other and their oil reserves are tied to the US dollar, they aren't a threat, and the US gets more out of the deal than the countries that are actually producing the oil themselves. But even when Gaddafi dipped his toes in that direction, the global powers didn't do much besides hostage exchanges and a few skirmishes. Mostly, they just wanted to make it clear that Gaddafi was testing the waters too much for their liking and that he needed to get back in line. The real problems came when Gaddafi made enough friends in Africa to suggest that they create a unified African currency alongside the Middle Eastern countries that were willing to get in on the action, that the tides started to change. That's when he was officially labeled as a terrorist and a dictator. You see, despite Africa being the richest continent in natural commodities, it's also the poorest continent. If they aren't living in outright poverty, then there's civil war and broken economies that are raging all over the continent. This is by design. If Africa unites its natural resources, it'll put the might and wealth of the British Empire in its heyday to shame. Keeping Africa unstable is the perfect way to keep them too occupied with their own problems to get themselves organized. The chances of Gaddafi uniting even half of Africa were slim, but still, they couldn't take that risk, and we all know what happened to Gaddafi then. But Gaddafi wasn't the first one to think about uniting Africa. That already happened in the 1960s in South Africa. Let's make one thing clear. The institution that was apartheid was a horrible humanitarian hellscape of a situation. But the rest of the world wasn't too fussed about the suffering that was going on there. The US and Britain were more than happy to do business with the country at first. Heck, the royal family visited South Africa often enough, always on friendly terms and with great benefits to all the parties involved. As long as South Africa had exports available that were traded in the US dollar and the Brits had shares in their diamond and gold mines, no one gave a toss about who was being mistreated. Things changed drastically when the father of apartheid, Hendrik Verwoerd, suggested a united African currency. If South Africa could take control of the southern point of Africa, they'd have enough resources to make it happen. And they got really, really close to making moves in that direction. Their strong military and natural commodities made this a very real possibility. If they got the southern point all under one roof, they'd have gold, oil, diamonds, steel, iron, coal, you name it. When it became clear that South Africa was rich enough and had the capability to get the South under their thumb, then the world suddenly had a problem with the humanitarian crimes that were being committed there. South Africa was sanctioned from the rest of the world. But instead of crippling the economy, South Africa thrived just fine under its own steam without the US dollar. So the US started working to uproot South Africa from within. Under the guise that they cared about the people, they funded the uprising. Only then did the UN mention crimes against humanity. And only after the rand had the potential to displace the pound did Britain denounce the country that it had had its claws in for the past 400 years. After all, it's okay if people are dying, just not when they have the potential to make more money than the ones at the top are making. Hendrik Verwoerd was assassinated, the apartheid regime was dismantled, and since then, South Africa has been kept on the edge of poverty, rife with corruption, and under constant threat of civil war. Just unstable enough to keep them from growing enough to run on their own steam. But what happens if BRICS comes onto the scene? This isn't one single country we're talking about anymore. We're talking about big players here. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa are all wealthy in their own right. But collectively, they have a combined GDP that's $1 billion more than the US. It doesn't sound like much now, but remember, that number is going to climb even higher with countries like Algeria, Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Bolivia signing on in 2024. The sheer manpower, monetary reserves, and resources that these countries come with is going to tip that seesaw's nose in favor of BRICS becoming a reality, and the US's old tactics of destabilizing a country from within aren't going to fly this time. China and Russia aren't going to play that game. India is never going to risk being under foreign control ever again. And even if the rest aren't as powerful, they've at least got some mega countries to protect them now. So if the US can't play in the shadows like they usually do, well, forcing them out into the open is going to bring out the big guns. We're talking about nuclear war here. No superpower is going to hold back when the prize at the end of the day is world dominance, and more than half the world is itching to break away from a single trade currency. People believe that with more countries and demographics to make decisions together, there will be a more equal spread of interests and rights among them. As opposed to now, where one country rules them all with only its own interests in mind, then you have the fact that the US has been butting heads with Russia and China for half a century now. Before, those differences were always separate from each other. But now that Jinping and Putin are in the same boat, suddenly the threat becomes exponentially bigger. Forcing the US to react when it's already losing its hold on the world is like trapping an animal in a corner. If the US doesn't see any other way out, they will go for the nuclear Hail Mary pass, even if that means ripping the world apart to keep their grip firmly in place. They'd rather rule over rubble than nothing at all. The fact of the matter is that BRICS is moving forward, and they've got enough people on board to make this a very real possibility. Most of Africa and the Middle East are looking at BRICS in an effort to move away from the US dollar, which decides their fates. It's almost certain that many more will jump the dollar ship in the next year or two. One thing is for sure, the US isn't going to relinquish its hold without a fight. Surrendering control is not, and will never be, an option. But is America really in any shape to go to war? They're involved in just about every single conflict going on in the world already, and it's not like anyone believes that their leadership is capable of running the currency that controls the entire planet anyway. Our faith in the dollar is fading more and more every day, and if they decide that a war on the ground can't be won, Well, they might not have the world's support or the option to poison BRICS from the inside, but at least they still have the biggest nuclear arsenal to count on. We've been expecting World War III for the past 20 years. It was always going to be between the US and one of its many enemies. But now the biggest dogs in the park have formed alliances, and they're going to attempt to dethrone the dollar as a pack. Will America let them run wild and allow BRICS to come to pass? Or is it going to fight to keep its throne? Only time will tell, and time is running out. But what do you think? Will BRICS launch without any reaction from the US? Or is it enough to tilt half a century of animosity to finally come to a disastrous head? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and check out some of our other uploads that are on your screen right now. Until next time, cheers!